That's good. Showing up. Hey, 3 subscribers. How about that?
Sounds like if that's you, me, and Harry. Hey everyone, we're going to wait just a few minutes to get started. Let people trickle in. For everyone who just joined, we're going to wait a few minutes for people to trickle in before we start.
Afternoon.
Co-chairs, I believe we have the majority of our members here. If you'd like to get started.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you, Lindsay. Here. All right, people. My name is Flozell Daniels Jr., and I have the privilege of co-chairing this Transportation Committee of the Climate Task Force with my colleague, Eric. Eric, are you there? Oh, there he is. And so we will call this meeting to order. And Lindsay, can you do the roll call for us?
Dr. Eric Calabota. And members, please unmute yourselves and state what you're doing.
Here.
Flozell Daniels.
Here.
Vivian Johnson.
Here.
Bethany Stitch. Viyaha Goku.
Here.
Chet Chasson.
Here.
Scott Gamble. Wiley Guilfoyle. Kent Rogers.
Here.
Danero Washington.
Present.
Jessica Kemp.
Here.
Ann Vale.
Here.
Joe Anati.
I'm here.
Alex Pazorki.
Here.
Harriet Trigoni.
Here.
And chairs, we do have a quorum.
Fantastic. And a full house too. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to ask Eric to walk us through the meeting logistics here. Eric?
Thank you. We are recording this meeting. If you'll leave your camera on and be present during the meeting, so we prefer you not get up and walk out for some reason, but if it would help with the feedback if you're not speaking, if you will put your attendance on mute, and that way it'll limit the feedback we get. You can use the chat box to let us know if you're having any technical difficulties. And if you hold your questions until the end of each agenda item, it'll help for a smoother meeting. And, you know, we only members are on the Zoom call. The public is attending through a live stream, and the public can submit comments via email to climate@la.gov. In the subject line of your email, make reference to the Transportation Committee and the agenda item number. And you'll need to have the body of your message should include your name and address before you comment. At the end of the meeting, after we discuss next steps, we'll wait 3 minutes to give people time to send in their last few comments they may have, members of the public, and then we'll read those comments into the record.
Fantastic. And do we want to do the approval of the agenda?
Yes. You've all have a copy of the agenda. And so I'm going to ask for a motion to approve the agenda for today's meeting.
Motion.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, well, Wiley Guilfoyle has joined the meeting. I see he's on camera. So, okay, thank you.
Fantastic. And I think Why don't we start with opening remarks Eric, if you could get us started, and then I'll follow up after you, and we'll get this meeting moving through.
Be happy to.
Yeah.
I want to welcome everybody, and I just want to say that up front, we're open to any and all ideas and concerns that you may have as we move through this process. So please don't be shy about speaking up. Also want to introduce Connie Betts, who is another person from DOTD, and she's going to be my second in this. And she's the administrator of our transportation planning section. Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Eric. And as I indicated before, my name is Flozell Daniels, and I am the president and CEO of the Foundation for Louisiana. And Eric and I are completely excited to be able to work with the governor's office and Lindsay in particular, and the tremendous work that she's done to really get us to the point where we can start to move the important work of this task force forward. We do want to make sure, as Eric mentioned, that folks participate as freely and openly as possible. We are going to run both a tight ship as far as making sure we meet our goals and getting through in a timely manner. But we also want a fulsome and an exuberant even sort of expression of participation. We have the privilege of having so many talented people on this committee that we want to take full advantage, if you will, of all of your expertise and your experiences to inform what this committee will do to feed into the larger task forces, what we think hopefully will be a historic set of recommendations. This is the first of our 10 committees meetings and advisory meetings. And so bear with us as we sort of work through the virtual logistics of making sure that folks can fully participate and be seen and heard. And I'm also, let's see here, going through my notes. So yeah, so I'll turn this over to Lindsay. We're going to move to agenda item number 5 for the presentation of the Climate Task Force charge. Lindsay's going to walk us through the structure and the process and the timeline so that we can all get on the same page from that perspective. And certainly there'll be time later in the meeting to check in if folks have any questions or concerns about that. And so Lindsay, why don't you take it over from here?
Thank you, Flozell and Eric. As Flozell mentioned, I'm Lindsay Cooper. I work in the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities. Our team will be staffing this effort. So me alongside Charles Sutcliffe is also on this call, and Carrie Vanikoff will be the climate team your go-to on all of these efforts, but I'll be helping you guys with the Transportation Committee. So let's start off with, in this agenda item, we'll talk about some background of why we're here and what we're doing, the Climate Initiative Task Force as a whole, and then narrowing down to the Transportation Committee and what we're going to be doing. So to start off on this slide, we're brought together by an executive order that the governor signed in August of this year, before our 7 hurricanes that struck Louisiana. And in this executive order, he established the charge and vision that Louisiana can and will reduce greenhouse gas emissions to limit the impacts of climate change in Louisiana. And even just simply this charge here really offers and acknowledges head on this dual reality that Louisiana deals with, that we're extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, but we also have a leadership role in energy production, in industry, in agriculture, and in transportation as well. And so for that, we must also account for our emission reduction. And so with that in mind, this effort that we're working with in Louisiana through the Climate Task Force is going to focus solely on the mitigation and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. We have some great adaptation efforts that are underway in Louisiana, and we know that dealing with the impacts of greenhouse gases itself is enough to put a whole team to work. So that's what we'll be addressing here. And having emission reduction goals set from the beginning of our effort will really guide us of where we're going in this effort. We won't have to argue over what our goals are because the governor has laid them out in the executive order. And so these 3 emission goals, as you might have seen other states have and other countries have, there's a short-term goal of a 26 to 28% reduction of emissions from 2005 levels by 2025. There's also an interim goal of 40 to 50% reduction by 2030, and then the final goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. So the work of the task force, the committees, and this group especially, will all be working to set Louisiana on a trajectory to meet these emissions goals. And so everything that we will do in these groups is intended to help Louisiana reach these emission goals. So why have we chosen these goals? Simply put, we need to reverse the impacts of climate change in Louisiana by reducing emissions. Human activities are already responsible for 1 degree warming above pre-industrial levels, and trends show that we're headed to at least 1.5 degrees Celsius further warming, trending towards 2 degrees. And so Louisiana needs to do our part. We need to reduce our emissions, and not only to minimize risk for our health and livelihood, food security, water supply, but we also need to lower the need for adaptation to climate change in Louisiana. And so what does this look like to do our part? What does this look like for a state like Louisiana? Louisiana now ranks 8th in total emissions across all of the United States. As you can tell on this graphic, we're pretty closely tied to New York, which is number 9. And that just highlights how great Louisiana's emissions are per capita compared to other states. And so if we zoom in and look at Louisiana's emissions per GDP and per capita, when we look at per GDP, Louisiana ranks 4th among states. And when we compare states based on emissions per capita, Louisiana ranks 5th in that. And so we need to recognize that Louisiana's emissions are different from the emissions of other states. So though Louisiana and New York might be closely tied in our emissions, the emissions in Louisiana look a little bit different. And so we need to acknowledge that Louisiana supplies a lot of the chemicals, a lot of the oil and gas, a lot of the industry for other states that our nation depends on, but also that our economy and our jobs depend on as well. But we need to see that this comes with impacts. This comes with greenhouse gas emissions, which have brought us here today. So when we think about the impact of such high emissions, there are a lot of different things that we see already in Louisiana. As the National Climate Assessment outlines here, we have increasing infrastructure and health risks from climate change. And so if we have increasing infrastructure risks from flooding, that costs more tax dollars to repair, and it damages our supply chain. And secondly, climate change increases flood risk in coastal regions, which requires more state tax dollars to repair after flooding events, more federal money to recover after storms as well. So it's actually costing us a lot for recovering from these events. And as you can tell from the graphic below on the right, we will only continue to see the impacts exacerbate over time. And it's not just a linear trajectory that we're on. We're on a very exponential increase over time. And just to dive a little bit deeper into this, there will also be impacts on our natural systems and on the economic and health risks for our communities as well. If we are thinking about this in the transportation lens, you can see in that graphic that The changes in heat will affect our ability to work outdoors. In transportation, this is especially important. We need workers and contractors and engineers outside all day being able to build the infrastructure that we heavily rely on. And so the change in these hours that people can work will affect how quickly we can build the infrastructure that is critical to Louisiana. If we dive a little bit deeper into this in Louisiana, we really can see how this is an interconnected system. All of these impacts are tied together, and it really results in cascading effects for Louisiana. It affects our ecosystems, our economies, our environment, all tied together. And I think this really shows that we can't adequately minimize or adapt to the impacts of climate change unless we are reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. It's that interconnectivity that shows us we also have to be reducing emissions in order to aid our adaptation efforts. So our state faces these extreme challenges, but what are we doing to address this? Setting climate emission reduction goals is not enough on its own, because we recognize for Louisiana, these are some pretty hefty goals. They're attainable, but they are lofty. And for this reason, Louisiana needs a path to meet them. And the Climate Initiative Task Force that was set up by the governor in August is exactly the vehicle to do that, to set us on the right path. So just as a reminder, we touched on this already, but this is what we're working towards, this vision that the governor laid forth of reducing our emissions, limiting the impacts of climate change, while maintaining our position as a leader. And that's all going to set us on the trajectory to meet these emission reduction goals. So we outlined these 5 values for our climate task force as a whole when they first met earlier in November. And we've brought together in this transportation group alone, as you all can see, but also our other groups and in the task force as a whole, we brought together a lot of different perspectives and a lot of people that might not otherwise be in the same room. And so we expect that we'll handle conversations with each other with respect and integrity, that will be transparent in what our objectives are and how we really see the processes moving forward. And also that this will be a science-based and consensus-driven public process. All these meetings will be public, and we really do want the public to be a part of this as well. And so we'll keep those values in mind as we move forward. But of course, we know that only a 23-person task force can't be expected to solely by itself set Louisiana on a path to meet these emission goals. So we've also created some subgroups, as Roselle mentioned earlier. This is just one of the 10 subgroups that we have set up. So under the task force, we have 6 sector emissions-based sector committees, and these are all 6 of these groups are looking at the major emission sectors in Louisiana. And these groups will all be assisted by 4 advisory groups. So this is scientific, equity, finance, and legal. And we saw that these were for needs, for expertise that we need to inform all of the committees. So those groups will function there to bring in expertise to the whole. If we look a little bit more at the roles of these groups, the sector committees, so which is you guys in transportation, your job will be to scope our emission sources and sinks in the transportation sector. And also, as we move into 2021, the goals will be to develop and evaluate emission reduction strategies. And as I mentioned on the prior slide, the advisory groups will work alongside the sector committees as well as the task force to really evaluate how strategies can be successful through their subject matter lens. So through those 4 subject matter lenses, and also providing advice upon request of the different groups. And then lastly, The task force as a whole, that 23-member body, will steer the direction of the overall climate initiative. And they will develop and approve the interim and final reports of this effort. And just to note on this slide, as I briefly said earlier, the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities, which is led by the Executive Assistant to the Governor on Coastal Activities, will chair staff and provide direction to the Climate Initiative Task Force, but the staff will also be working alongside the task force members, the sector committees, the advisory groups, and also the public as we work to develop these emission proposals and eventually these reports together. And so we'll also be assisted by the Water Institute of the Gulf that will be leading the planning process as we move forward and as we work towards this final strategy. So all of these groups and staff will collaborate and be working towards deliverables that are framed in the executive order. And so these have been laid forth, the interim and the final report, by the governor already. So though this group is tasked to help Louisiana meet our emission reduction goals, we need some baby steps to get there first. And that will be the creation of an interim and a final report. That interim report will be published in just 2 months from today, actually. And the final report will be produced in 1 year from then. And kind of sandwiched in between, we'll do an update to the greenhouse gas inventory for Louisiana. And this last update was done in 2010 with 2005 data. So this is great for our baseline. We're reducing emissions from that 2005 baseline. But we need to know where our emissions stand now. And so we'll be getting an updated inventory. We're working in partnership with some different state agencies to get that done through the LSU Center for Energy Studies. And so we'll anticipate that we'll have some initial deliverables from that in the middle of 2021. So some updated data for us to work with. When we look at the process as a whole, don't worry, I won't belabor every point on here, but I wanted to show that though this is a short timeline, 2 months and then 14 months to our final report, we do have a process in place to meet these deliverables. And so our process will ensure that we remain on track, that we don't get stuck in one step, and that we remain grounded in process and understand the purpose of everything as we're moving forward towards those deliverables. So let's zoom in to the interim report a little bit. This will focus on outlining the climate risks that Louisiana faces. Secondly, I will talk through the mission and vision of this effort and the process by which we're going to get there. Also, the committees and advisory groups will provide an overview and they will establish objectives, part of the conversation we'll have today. And then we'll also identify some opportunities and challenges for the groups as we are moving into 2021 and laying out that 2021 work plan. So there's no, and I believe I've talked with most of you about this before, but there's no pressure to develop solutions in the first meeting or to have the perfect solutions frame. That's something we'll spend a lot of 2021 on, but framing this interim report and framing the conversation in a way that really brings us all together and on the same page is really important. And that's what the interim report will do, especially since there is urgency. This is only 2 months away. And so we want to be sure to be transparent and to be open about our objectives and opportunities and challenges that we see in this effort. And so with that, I'd like to take any questions on this climate overview before we move forward.
Lindsay, we want to remind everyone also that you can also post questions in the chat, just in case you want to have those captured there. I think there's one question from Harriet asking if we could get a copy of the slide deck later on, Lindsay.
Absolutely, Harriet. I'll send out a slide deck to everyone after.
Super. Great, thank you. Are there any questions so far before Lindsay moves on? No? Okay. All right, Lindsay. Sounds like we're doing pretty good.
Okay, great. So let's next zoom in a little bit on the Transportation Committee. I know that's a lot of big picture process. So in light of the task force as a whole, what does this mean for our group here? So as I mentioned earlier, when we discussed roles, the primary charge of the committees is that they would develop and evaluate emission reduction proposals and create implementation strategies to reach our emission reduction goals. However, as I just noted with the interim report, there will be some other steps we need to do before we get into this development of proposals. And that will just ensure that we're effectively developing proposals later. So the charge specific for the Transportation Committee, that means for us that our charge will look like examining opportunities to lower the emissions from transportation related sources. And this includes promoting alternative and renewable fuels, idle reduction measures, fuel economy improvement, new technologies, and cleaner modes of transportation. And I'll say that this is our starting point. And as we continue to interact in this committee and consider your feedback, we'll build on this charge as well. So don't feel like we're constrained to just what has been mentioned here. And so with that, I'll say that let's move into the next agenda item 6. We'll take a little break in the presentation. I'll call each of you out by name, just in the order that we did the roll call, starting with our co-chairs, and just ask for you to give a minute or two introduction about your name, your occupation, expertise, just a way that we can get to know each other, even though we can't be in person, a way that we can know who we're working with and what resources we have on this group. So with that, I will call first on Eric.
Sure, thank you. Eric Calaboda, I'm the Deputy Secretary at DOTD, and I've been in the transportation business for 40 years now. And so I've done a lot of transportation planning and highway safety work, worked with preservation type activities that our department engages in. And so, I've been in done a lot of public administration, obviously, which is what I primarily do right now. So that's it.
Lozelle.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. And I did want to share with everyone that my camera is not working, so it's the only reason I'm not joining, if you will, by way of the camera. Flozell Daniels, President and CEO of the Foundation for Louisiana. And I'm here, I think, by way of a couple of points. One is we at the foundation have been engaged in the overall sort of climate change policy conversation since our founding 15 years ago. And we created a climate resiliency leverage fund nearly 8 years ago. And now that has expanded into a climate portfolio. So we engage with Louisianans at every sector of society around policy opportunities to mitigate the challenges with climate and to also create expansive opportunities for Louisianans, both economically as well as a quality of life and health perspective. And I'm also chairman of the board of the New Orleans Regional Transit Authority and have a perspective from that angle with regard to what it takes to practically provide transit in a way that's equitable and fair. It gets people to work, to school, and to their families, and increasingly doing that in a way that is environmentally sound and that meets this climate challenge of the moment that we're in. I'm delighted to be here with you guys doing this work. Thanks, Lindsay.
Vivian Johnson.
Had to unmute. My name's Vivian Johnson. 28 years. mostly doing air quality work. The last 20 years has been in the role of air quality. The last 6 years, I was introduced into the Alternative Fuel Corridor program that FHWA has. We've worked hard to expand the interstate corridors in Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, Arkansas, such that you have businesses and the general public able to use alternative fuel sources and come into our state without having to worry about where they're going to find fuel. And I think some of these alternative fuel sources are one of the reasons why I was asked to be on this committee.
Thanks. Dr. Gopi?
I'm sorry, I'm trying to unmute. I'm Vijay Gopu. I'm Associate Director at the Louisiana Transportation Research Center. I also hold the Stoller Professorship at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And I also served as the Department Chair for Civil Engineering at Tulane University and served as the Program Director for the Civil and Mechanical Systems Program at the National Science Foundation, and as the Associate Director for the University Transportation Center for Alabama. I've been involved with civil engineering program research for over 42 years and dealt with managing University Transportation Center programs, both in Louisiana and Alabama. And I've worked with faculty addressing a wide spectrum of issues related to transportation, environmental planning, safety, all kinds of issues that were funded through the federal DOT program. And that's my background. I'm a structural engineer dealing with civil infrastructure.
Chet Chasson?
Yeah, I'm Chet Chasson. I'm the Executive Director for the Greater Lafourche Port Commission, which is in charge of Port Fourche and the South Lafourche Airport here in Galliano, Louisiana. By education, I have a master's degree in public administration. That's a broad spectrum, but that's pretty much what I do on a daily basis here at the Port Commission. And dealing with infrastructure issues from a land side, water side, and airspace as well with the airport.
Wiley Guilford.
Executive Director to Lake Powell Port Commission, 25 years. Deal with land, sea, and rail.
Kent Rogers.
Kent Rogers, I'm the Executive Director for the Northwest Louisiana Council of Governments. We're the MPO, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, area of Louisiana. See the long-range transportation planning for the area, a regional transportation safety coalition, services transportation committee, and several other transportation.
Deniro Washington.
Afternoon, all. My name is Deniro Washington. I serve as the Chief Executive Officer for SportTran, which is the transit agency for the cities of Shreveport and Bossier. I also serve as the president of the Louisiana Public Transit Association for Louisiana. And also I serve on the Louisiana Clean Fuels Board. Most notably, over the last 8 years, we've kind of spent converting our transit fleet from diesel to CNG electric buses. And now our heavy duty fleet is now 100% electric. 100% alternative fuels. I apologize.
Jessica Kemp.
Hi, I'm Jessica Kemp. I'm Vice President of the Center for Planning Excellence based in Baton Rouge, but we work statewide. The expertise I bring to the group here is in complete streets and transit and active transportation modes. And then I think very importantly for this conversation, land use planning and policy and the impacts that that has on our transportation needs and systems.
Ann Bale.
I'm Executive Director of Louisiana Clean Fuels. We're a United States Department of Energy designated Clean Cities Coalition, and our entire mission is to reduce emissions in the transportation sector, whether they're greenhouse gas emissions or NOx. And we work with public and private fleets. We work with the DEQ, like with Vivian Johnson and air quality on the corridors. We work with fleets like De Niro's Sportran to help them to reduce emissions. And we help educate the general public, utilities, policymakers on alternative fuels and emission reduction practices. And we also have an annual report where our fleets tell us what their fuel consumption is and their alternative fuel use is, and we measure the greenhouse gas emission impacts of these changes annually. So we not only get out and educate the public, but we collect data on the impacts of the projects and the programs that we are working on.
And Scott, again, I just saw your message. I apologize for skipping you. Scott, you can go ahead. You might be on mute, Scott.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the airport manager here in Alexandria International Airport. I've been
Scott,
in a, yes?
you're coming through very choppy for me, at least.
Yeah.
Okay. Is this any better?
No.
No, it's still choppy.
Lindsay, do we have call-in information for this call as well? I find sometimes when my laptop audio won't work, I have to use my phone. Do we?
Yeah, Scott, there is call-in information on the calendar invitation that I sent out, if that might work better.
Okay.
And Scott sent me a message to skip him for now. We'll come back to you
That
before
makes
we finish out on this agenda.
Thank you. Scott.
Joe and Nadi.
Yes, thank you. My name is Joe Nadi. I'm a vice president of programs for a consulting firm called Gladstein Neandros and Associates. We're based out of Santa Monica, California, but I'm local. I'm based in Jefferson Parish, outside of New Orleans. So it's an honor to be serving on the committee with a rather esteemed group of colleagues. I'm really thrilled to be here. My expertise is on transportation incentives and program development, project development. We work with some of the biggest OEMs across the US and technology manufacturers, fleets, innovative developers to bring to bear the best, newest, most efficient and innovative pieces of technology. As part of that, new is often expensive. And so that's where my team comes in. We develop and design incentive programs. We coordinate with funding agencies, and ultimately we aim to secure those incentives. Our team has successfully secured over $800 million across the US and Canada in our history. And so I'm looking forward to leveraging some of those resources for the efforts here. So thank you again.
Alex, please.
Hey, good afternoon, y'all. I'm Alex Pozorski. I'm the executive director of Ride New Orleans. We're a nonprofit group that works for better public transit policies in the New Orleans region, policies that mean better transit for a wide range of folks, provides a robust quality of life, whether you have access to a car or not. The relevance I think I bring here is that better public transit is obviously a critical piece of fighting climate change. But I think too often the focus is solely on the technical, on the individual vehicle or the technologies for fueling that vehicle, which is of course very important, but we could have every public transit vehicle in LA have zero, in Louisiana have zero emissions. And we might not make that much of a dent, but if we can create public transit that helps 40 people make the choice to leave their cars at home once a week and choose a bus for a trip, that's the stuff that starts to make a real difference, and very interested in discussing sort of the starting point for how we see those statewide policies that can help make that happen in our communities throughout the state.
Harriet?
Hi, I'm Harriet Tregoning. I'm currently the director of an organization called NUMO, the New Urban Mobility Alliance. It's housed at the World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C., and it's an alliance organization with a couple hundred members, public, private, nonprofit, around the world. You use some of the data from the World Resources Institute in your presentation, Lindsay, looking at where Louisiana ranked compared to other places. We have a very robust climate program at WRI. I was the Assistant Secretary for Community Planning and Development in the Obama administration, and I ran a little national disaster resilience competition that both the state of Louisiana and New Orleans were winning entries for. Before that, I was the city planning director in the District of Columbia for the last 2 mayors. I was on the board of our transit agency, WMATA, the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Agency, and also a member of the MPO, the Washington Metropolitan Transportation Planning Board. I was also a state official. I worked for the governor of Maryland, Governor Glendening, where I was planning secretary, but I also became a special secretary for smart growth and basically was kind of an Uber secretary over most of the other cabinet agencies when it came to coordinating investments, which is an interesting way, maybe an interesting thing to think about when it comes to a big cross-cutting goal like climate and how that might potentially work. I know that in another way that Louisiana is both different than other states and maybe most impacted is the amount of disaster that the state has been subject to in terms of extreme weather and flooding, and also the amount of money that the state has gotten. I'm very interested in trying to make the connections between recovery and preparedness and new transportation investments that would give residents of Louisiana lots better access without necessarily the cost of every driver having to own their own car.
We'll go back to Scott. I believe he has been called. Scott, I think I unmuted you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, wonderful.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. My name is Scott Gamble. I'm the airport manager here in Alexandria International Airport. I've been in aviation management for over 30 years, and I've been the airport director here in Alexandria for the past 27 years. I work very closely with the Louisiana Airport Managers and Associates, and work very close with all the Louisiana airports. So expect to utilize all the airports in our task.
I believe that is all of our members for the meeting. So now we'll move on to agenda item 7 and jump back just to a little bit more of the presentation. I'll talk now through our process, what our process looks like. So we've defined those deliverables and timelines, but how will we get there? And so we're using a process called structured decision making that will help us develop this climate strategy to achieve the emission reduction goals that the government has set forth. We'll talk a little bit about this. So SDM as a process is not just a process for process's sake. The point is that we want this to be in an objective and transparent and structured way. We want this whole process to be very clear and very clearly laid out as well. And so it's not just a process to make more processes, but this is really the integration of science and policy, which is very important when we're talking about climate emissions, because it is the policy side as we've discussed, but it's also the science of emissions that needs to be considered. And so this process will provide a transparent and structured way that we can articulate all of our objectives. So including those that target emission reduction, but also our economic and societal objectives in this effort. SDM will also help us to evaluate solutions objectively against those goals and against science and the data that we have. And then the last real benefit of this process is evaluating trade-offs between solutions to guide the decision. So this process will really take us through each step as we're moving forward in this effort. So to look at the framework as a whole, SDM offers 6 steps for a process, and we'll be taking you guys and we'll be going through this process together as we work towards that final report. And so today we'll start with step 1 and 2, but as we move forward, we'll keep moving along in the steps. So to briefly touch on all of them, the first step is defining the problem. So setting the context of why we're here. What is the decision that needs to be made? Secondly, we'll determine our objectives and what we want to get from this effort. Third, we'll identify alternatives. We'll have a proposal solicitation for emission reduction proposals in each of our different sectors. So that's something that you as the Transportation Committee, but also as the public, members of the public will be able to turn in proposals that we as a committee then in step 4 will evaluate, and we'll evaluate those alternatives and we'll start to build our own solution set of emission reduction solutions in transportation. And then as we get into next summer, I guess late summer, we'll do a trade-off analysis. And so putting together all of our solutions from the different committees and understanding how they interact with one another. How can we build off of one solution to create a set of well-rounded solutions? So really bringing everything together in that step. And then as we move into next fall, this is where we'll start making the decisions and we'll take action by producing this final climate strategy. So as you can see, these 6 steps will each in their own take some effort to define, but this will really guide us along the process. So just to bring us back to defining the problem, so step 1, we first have to start with a common understanding of why we're here and what initiated the SDM process. So as we've talked about, this for our effort looks like driving up global temperatures, rising sea levels, increasing risk that disproportionately impact residents with the fewest resources. That is all rooted in emissions of climate change. But as I mentioned, SDM is the convergence of science and policy. So it's also important that we look at the science that will drive us through our emissions overview. So as I mentioned, our most recent emission inventory until next year is the one that was done in 2010, and that used 2005 data. So we're looking here at 2005 data, which is our baseline data for those emission goals. And so a few things I want to point out here to draw your eye to are first that CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion accounts for 84% of Louisiana's emissions. So these emissions are carbon dioxide, but as you can note from that chart on the left, we're also talking about other emissions. So there's methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur tetrachloride, hydrofluorocarbons, and other greenhouse gas emissions. But we're mainly focusing on that 84%. And so if we take that blue circle on the left in fossil fuel combustion, and then we look at what that is made of on the right, we get this pie chart, which is 45% industrial,
All my fellow Texans out there.
26% transportation, and then electric power and commercial and residential buildings are a smaller portion. And Louisiana is very unique in the United States, as we briefly touched on earlier, but the predominance of our emissions come from the industrial sector. That sets us apart a little bit. But here in this committee, we'll focus on transportation. So looking at our emission sources in transportation, this is the scope of emissions that we will be looking at in this committee. And this committee will create actions and strategies to reduce emissions in these different sources that we have outlined. So that includes primarily passenger cars and motorcycles, with light duty trucks secondary, and then aircraft, boats, farm construction, utility, and locomotive emissions, and then heavy duty vehicles at 3%. So this is our committee scope. So these slides set up the problem well, and the problem all the way from the task force in Louisiana, all the way narrowed down to our transportation committee. So now that we have defined these objectives, now that we've defined the decision context, we must move into step 2, which is looking at our objectives. And so the context of this problem should define how we look at our objectives. And really, when I'm talking about objectives here, it's what do we care about? So of course we have this overarching goal of emission reduction, but even the governor in his imperative and in his vision, he mentioned that this is a balance of reducing emissions while limiting impacts on people and maintaining our position as a leader in industry. So there are other important objectives that need to be captured as we start out in this process. And so when we look to transportation, it's reasonable to assume that viability of transportation providers and increased access to transportation are important objectives that we have as we're looking to reduce emissions. And below that, we'll use the fundamental objectives that we set to define the needs objectives. So how do we intend to reach our goals, and what will that look like over the course of our effort? And so today we're really here to think through what these objectives are. All of you come from, as we just heard in introductions, all of you come from very different backgrounds and expertise, and that needs to be part of the conversation here. And our backgrounds affect the decisions we make, whether we recognize it or not. And so it's important that we have a transparent process, as is one of our pillars of this effort. It's important that we transparently identify the objectives that will guide us in this effort. So with that, we will move to agenda item number 8, identifying our committee objectives. So with all of this said, we'd like to open up a discussion of this committee's objectives with the group. And this is our first big step as a group that allows us to talk through what are our goals before we just jump to emission reduction solutions. So today we'll discuss really what we care about. Yes, emission reduction in transportation is our primary goal, but what else will inform this effort to reduce emissions? And we have the whole rest of the process to figure out how to get there, to negotiate, to compromise, but today it's really the opportunity just to lay it all out there and start to think through what our objectives are. So with that, we want to get everyone's feedback, but I'll start by calling on a few people before opening up the floor to discussion. And so that everyone has the opportunity to discuss their objectives, I just ask you to limit your remarks to maybe 3 minutes or so. And so I'll leave presenter mode and actually make some notes on the slide as we go through this. So I'd like to take this to Flozell first as one of our chairs. So Flozell is the chair of the New Orleans RTA, and with your background in community development and resilience building, what do you care about in this effort, and what do you think are objectives that will guide us?
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. I'll be brief. I think we were given this charge by the governor to look at this opportunity to really have an impact on climate change and to come up with some solutions that fit for Louisiana and all the challenges that you pointed out in your earlier presentation. I think top of mind from my perspective is really focusing on the emissions and how they drive so much of the science around climate change and what that means for Louisianans, particularly people who are in so-called vulnerable areas or who themselves are vulnerable, and what it means for us to be in this moment in history to identify strategies that are going to really allow us to make decisions to have a real impact. I think, it's not too lofty a goal or an objective to think about how the recommendations that come out of this committee ought to alter the face of history for how Louisianans think about transportation and building a future for our children and grandchildren and generations to come. I'm hoping our work is guided from that perspective and that we really land on some recommendations that substantially move the sort of emissions metrics in a way that we'll see will have benefit in the future.
And Eric is our other co-chair. With your expertise in working with DETD and also being the deputy secretary over there, what do you think should guide this process and what matters to you?
Well, I would reinforce what Flozell said, but I'm interested to hear what people have to say. And so I hope you'll speak your mind about not only what your ideas are, but also any concerns that you might have as we move through this. But one of my main points I want to make now is that we all have to keep in mind as we go through this, the political and cultural environment that we live in. And so our recommendations ultimately have to be acceptable to the average citizen in the state and the people that they elect if we have any chance of getting any of this implemented. So I just want to remind everybody of that, and I'm going to keep bringing that back because I view one of my ultimate roles is to be a salesman for the recommendations. And so I've got to try to keep that in mind as we move through this process.
So Chet, I'll call on you first. As your experience as an airport director and as a major port director with Port Fourchon, what do you have in mind? What is important to you in this effort?
I think from my perspective, and I'm glad Eric mentioned what he said, I think first off, we need to be realistic. We need to understand that there are a lot of places, especially in the state of Louisiana, that are remote. So it's difficult to say we can do one thing for everyone. I'm not saying that that's what we're saying or what anybody's saying, but there's going to have to be a lot of different, for lack of a better term, fingers to this. And we can do some things in the urban areas that we just won't be able to do in the rural areas in terms of transportation. But I think there are some things that we need to look at in terms of, the types of fuels that we use, obviously, maybe from moving away from oil-based majority to maybe natural gas as a buffer between electricity or battery power or what have you. But as we look forward into the far future, we have to understand and even work when we talk about what we use as a fuel source, whatever that is, especially if it goes towards electricity. We need to make sure that we think about our electrical grids and what we have, not only in Louisiana, but in the United States, and can it handle majority electrical vehicles, and what do we need to do as a society, as a state, to move forward in that realm, and make sure that our state is prepared to do what it needs to do from all realms of power and fuel source.
Just call on you as from a very different perspective as a planner with the Center for Planning Excellence. What do you have in mind?
Thanks. I think the thing that's at the top of mind right now is kind of a response to what Dr. Calavota said about this needing to be acceptable to the majority of people and elected officials. And I think a key to that is to think about this challenge and to frame our strategies and suggestions in terms of opportunity. And I certainly don't want to diminish the urgency of the challenge that is before us, but I think a combination of understanding that we have to do these things if we want a viable future, but to talk about them in terms of, like Flozell described them, an opportunity to thrive in a changing environment. And I think part of the task ahead of the task force is to influence public thinking. And I think that culture change and sharing knowledge and framing the challenge and opportunities is going to be critical to success, just as critical as the logistics of each of the strategies that we put together.
And just to note, everyone, we will have people taking notes on this call, and we'll do some behind the scenes work to really flesh out the objectives as well. So feel free, even if the concept of objectives might be confusing or not clear to you, feel free that you can speak your mind and they will be distilled and organized later on. So I just wanted to make that disclaimer, everyone. And with that, I'll open up the floor. I'd love to hear from all of the members. So we'll allow some time for people to speak. And again, just try to limit those remarks to a couple of minutes.
Hi, Lindsay. This is Anne with Louisiana Clean Fuels. Our objectives are to remove the barriers for adoption of fuel-saving measures and alternative fuels and emission reduction programs, whether those barriers are actually physical, like infrastructure and vehicle availability. We need to make sure that the fueling infrastructure is there and that dealers are educated on the vehicles and selling the vehicles, and they're available, and there's maintenance people to work on the vehicles. We can't implement alternative fuel saving programs if we don't have all the different pieces of the puzzle put together. And we have people who can work on the vehicles. Or that may be a perceived barrier, which is public opinion and awareness. So we have awareness campaigns and things. We're the boots on the ground there. We're doing these things every single day right now. And we are seeing the issues and the problems with some of the different fueling technologies, depending on how they're used. So we can very much get in there and know that there's not going to be a one size fits all or one silver bullet one fuel that's going to save the day. It's everything is a case by case basis. And another one of those barriers sometimes are regulatory. There may be policies that impede or enhance the adoption of alternative fuels or fuel saving measures. So we need to make sure that we work on that. These are things that we do already. And There is a mention about EV preparedness and utilities. We just had an entire webinar series for utilities to help them to prepare for the coming of heavy duty and electric vehicles. So we have a lot of education that needs to happen, and we need to try to be able to get that out to more people. And any solution that we all recommend as a group, we need to make sure that it's effective, that it results in measurable reductions of emissions, that it's attainable, that it's possible through the available technologies, and it's affordable. You know, there may be incentives needed, or we can take advantage of like the low hanging fruit of affordable ways to reduce emissions. Idle reduction and a mile not driven is emissions not, you know, put out there. Those are the most effective ways to reduce emissions the quickest for the smallest bang for the buck. So there's a lot of things besides alternative fuels and new vehicles and new fueling infrastructure that can help us to cut back on our vehicle emissions.
Lindsay, this is Alex from Ride New Orleans. Like just stressing again that more people taking transit, I think really has to be a part of any successful multifaceted solution here. And looking at that challenge, I think too often in public policy, transit is just seen as something that, well, if it exists, it works, we've done our job, let's move on. And there's not a lot of thought necessarily about how functional that transit is, whether it provides a real opportunity or a real choice for the people riding it. And that I think is one of the fundamental problems to address in the sense of what we're charged with here. If a transit line only comes once an hour, doesn't run on weekends or in the evening, it's not helpful for the people who rely on it. And it's certainly not helpful or convincing for anybody trying to make that switch. So that's I think a fundamental challenge I'm going to come back again and again to as far as how I see my role on this and really want to stress that right now.
This is Kent Rogers, and De Niro, Washington can attest to this, that I think in terms of the transit, it's going to take some mindset changes to get people to move that direction. We've done a lot of work with SportTran over the years to change their system, not only its buses and helping them to move away from diesel to clean energy, shifting some highway dollars to the transit side to help pay for those buses. But we've also looked at their overall system and getting away from some of those hub and spoke aspects of traditional transit into getting into more, I guess you could say, neighborhood related transit services, and then connections between those various different neighborhoods and workplaces. But that next step with all that, I think, is more of a, like you're saying, it's a big educational process, but it's also going to be a very big mindset change. And how you do that, I'm open to suggestions.
This is Harriet. I think the last two speakers had made some great points, and I would also say that one of the things that is true is that technology has enabled us to do more on-demand transportation, and a lot of transit systems all around the world are moving more and more towards some degree of on-demand. There is some fixed guideway transit in Louisiana, but there's opportunity for a lot more transit that may not be fixed guideway or fixed route or fixed schedule that could be flexible alternatives for folks. I know that in the presentation that Lindsay made about the objectives, they were example objectives, but I do think the point about making sure whatever we do in this transportation space, we're providing greater access to Louisiana residents, greater access to their daily needs, is really important. And that might be done through transportation. I don't know if it would be outside of our scope to consider also doing some of those things via technology and via electronic communication. As was just stated, a trip that you don't take absolutely reduces greenhouse gas emissions. And all of us during this year have learned that there are ways for us, whether we like it or not, to avoid taking trips and hopping on a call like this instead of meeting in person. There's a trip that all of us did not take in order to be here. And so thinking about including something like that in our scope might be useful, and something that other committees are probably not going to consider.
This is Vivian Johnson. I would like to add to what Harriet just said, as well as the others who spoke about urban transportation. It's very difficult, though, for those of us who live in rural areas, because I live in Clinton and I work in Baton Rouge. So I have a commute every day. We have tried at DEQ to get together van pools. We have tried to get dedicated buses so that people will ride. We tried it from Livingston Parish, Ascension Parish, to try to get people off the interstates so that we wouldn't have to make it a 12-lane highway in order to get people in for two time periods during the day. We get them in and then we get them out. The DOTD has developed the transportation center where they have cameras on all of the roadways. It's kind of a mindset. For the urbanites, it might be more palatable to take public transportation, but I can just about promise you that it's going to be real difficult to get those pickup trucks out from underneath the bodies of the folks that live in East Feliciana Parish along with me. So we're going to have to really, I guess the greater emissions are going to be in the greater population, but you can't, when we talked earlier about considering the diversity of Louisiana's geography, it's not only the geography, it's the cultures, it's the different cultures, because in your farming and your ranching communities, whether it's timber farming, agricultural farming, that's all transportation. So we're going to have to really look at that. We have a lot of timber and sand and gravel businesses out in our area. So, we're going to have to look at those big trucks too. And maybe how we can consolidate, I don't know, companies, or have some run at different hours, and not having the gravel trucks on the road while the commuters are on the road, something like that, to kind of minimize how much pollution you're putting in the air. We fought this with ozone and PM, so it'll be the same thing, fighting it with your CO2 in transportation.
Vivian, this is Flozell. Let me ask a question for you or anyone else on the committee, because I think you bring up a really important point. One of the things that Eric and I first discussed in planning for this is thinking about how different Louisiana is depending on where you land on the map. I like to tell people there are 3 different Louisianas, right? And trying to make sure that everyone can see their experience inside of the work that we do. Who's really talking to our neighbors in rural communities and ex-urban communities? Are there any places where we have reports with any fidelity at this point as to what they're thinking about this conversation, or is that something that's yet to be done from your perspective? Or anyone else can chime in. It may exist and I just not know about it.
Okay, from our perspective, especially where you had transit, that we tried to offer van pools and bus pools at different hours to match your work schedule.
Mm-hmm.
We've offered, I think through CRPC, if you ride the bus in, we'll get you a way home. If there's an emergency, if you have to go pick up your kid from school, if whatever, we will get you a ride home. We've offered all of this. It's not an easy sell. People are so afraid that they're going to miss something by not having their vehicle that they won't give it up. So it's a mindset. When you live 50 minutes away and you have to depend on somebody to come and get you rather than just walk outside to either your parking garage or the parking lot and get in your vehicle and leave, you know, those few minutes make people not want to use the public transportation. And when I tell you that I've been working with this for 20 years, it is, I mean, it's 20 years and we can't get that mindset. When I lived in Broadmoor, before I moved out to Clinton, when I lived in Broadmoor, I would have given anything to have a bus that I could get on, start my work day, you know, get my thoughts organized on the way in so that I wouldn't have to fight Florida Boulevard traffic and all the stoplights going downtown. But people even in Broadmoor won't do that.
Yeah.
So it's that mindset, Flazell.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, and we can maybe in future meetings cover, you know, something about the culture and the psychology piece that we're going to have to think about, even if it's not a formal objective. You know, there's some of the stuff we won't be responsible for, but just thinking about implementation and what actually works versus what we would like to work. You've really brought up an excellent point. So as we think about these recommendations that we'll be making and structuring, we want to give some thought to what's the evidence that those things will actually be picked up as a practice, and where do we need to do some work to increase the likelihood that they will, either by way of sort of personal, individual, family by family behavior, or the way institutions and the markets move. So thank you for that.
Mr. Daniels, this is Denero Washington. Speaking from a transit provider, I think one of the things that we have to do is kind of like all the rest of the providers, agencies have said, is we got to change the mindset. There are plenty of case studies out there now. I think Harriet hit it on the head when she was talking. There are several new technologies that are coming out in public transit that can work in the state of Louisiana. A lot of case studies out there show that they're working in other areas that have rural communities, such as using on-demand type models, moving away from some of the larger fixed route buses, but actually introducing some of our rural services, on-demand services. And how do we do public transit here in the state of Louisiana? I think it's a huge conversation that we have to all focus in and use over the next few years. You know, here in the Shreveport-Bossier market, we're working very hard with our NPO on how do we take the urban model and introduce on-demand in the rural parishes. We're hoping to do that next year. We just rolled out an on-demand service here in the Shreveport-Bossier area. That's going to be expanded into the rural areas to be able to make more of a hands-free phone call system app that people can request a vehicle for public transit, the same as you do for Uber and Lyft, and connect these people in real-time situations, and they'll know what time the vehicle is going to be there and be able to track. So how do we push that mindset out and give that creative context to the rest of the state of Louisiana, as well as changing that mindset? I think is going to be a huge challenge that we're going to need help with as we move forward. So that would be my objective on this committee, is to try to help change mindsets, help the urban areas, but also figure out how we connect the rural areas with public transportation that is true transportation that the citizens are desiring.
I would agree. This is Joe Anati. Excuse me. Denera, you raise a good point. I want to expand a little bit on it. I think there's an external focus that I would like to see this committee have. And I mean, the concept is all these solutions are being developed for Louisiana, as they should. But it doesn't mean that all of the solutions have to be developed in a vacuum by Louisianans. And there are committees all over the U.S. and Canada, North America, and Europe that are doing similar things. And I would hate to see their learnings not leveraged here. The second part of that externality is I can assure you from my conversations with leading OEMs and truck makers and automakers and technology providers, Louisiana is not a priority. We're not a population dense state. We're not a focused area. We don't have enticements and incentives to deploy the newest and the best transportation technologies. That's just a function of economics. But we can be. We can be seen as an area that fosters innovation. We can be seen as opportunistic, as cutting edge, and as leading and progressive. And I would like to see, by bringing in those OEMs and leading providers and innovative folks, bringing them into the fold here, inviting them to our conversations, getting their feedback on what it is that we're proposing to do. Because ultimately, whatever we propose won't work without whatever technology we're proposing to use, and we have to get that side of the argument included as well.
This is can I add something here?
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I've already spoken.
No, that's okay. Alex, you want to say something? Go ahead.
Just on the mindset and culture question, a quick comment. I think those are really important pieces to have the context for and to understand the challenge. But I think focusing too exclusively on that can be sort of its own trap. I think it can make it look more complicated than it actually is. At the end of the day, if someone is not taking a system, it's because it doesn't work for their needs, if they have other choices. So I think more trying to look in a solution-oriented way. Okay, what are those needs? How can we better meet that? Maybe again, it's a very different solution in terms of a rural or an exurban or a suburban or urban context. But I think there are a lot of things that we can do on that. I think that's a fundamental question. And then looking at, okay, how are we not able to meet those needs right now, and how can this committee and its recommendations help in the future for those needs to be met, to be able to provide that service that helps more people take it, which then will sort of be a self-fulfilling prophecy around the culture.
Lindsay, I'm going to add something to the various comments. I think the committee has to recognize there's a confluence of a lot of technologies that are coming into place. We have artificial intelligence. We have autonomous vehicles. All these are coming into picture, and with 70% or plus of our emissions are due to just gasoline and diesel fuels. There are about 15 countries which have already decided that they're going to go to zero emission vehicles over the next 10 to 20 years. And that is going to be coming regardless of whatever anybody is planning, because the train has left the station. The thing that's challenging is that's going to bring obviously zero emission, but it's going to have a very great impact, very disruptive. These technologies are extremely disruptive because we would then lose our fuel tax that we gain from the consumption of gasoline. How is that going to be addressed? Some of these countries have decided to tax based on vehicle mileage because there's no other way to collect taxes otherwise. And that's going to be something that has to be discussed and that has to be looked at. But for us to think that the gasoline vehicles are going to be there, they may not be disappearing in my lifetime, but they'll definitely be out of the picture in 30 years. Like you said, I think what we have to be looking at, this autonomous vehicles and artificial intelligence are going to make all this transit and all these other issues we're talking about disappear, because people can take their iPhone and just dial up and get a vehicle at the doorstep. That's not a big concern. I think we are basically lying to ourselves if we think these are not going to be available pretty soon. So what this state has to be prepared for is for legislation to address how to handle these technologies. Where are the charging stations for all these vehicles? So there's a lot of issues that needs to be looked at, keeping in mind that AI, autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles are going to be in vogue fairly soon. And California is not stupid. They've already said zero emission vehicles have to be in place in a certain number of years. I don't remember exactly, it is 2030 or 2035. It really doesn't matter. Norway has already decided after 2020, you cannot sell a gasoline powered vehicle in Norway, in Denmark, and so many other countries. So I think this at least 75% of our emissions would be addressed. Whether we do anything or not, this is going to be addressed. I'm telling you that.
That's a great point to make, VJ, and brings us back to the solution-oriented and developing those solutions. And as Alex did as well, thinking with these on-demand transit systems, how does that apply to emission reduction solutions? And just getting us in the frame of that committee charge that we have.
So if that's our frame, I mean, people have already mentioned reducing trips or obviating trips. So that's one potential solution. We can make trips shorter. If they're shorter, they might be able to be taken by some other mode rather than by a vehicle, like a gasoline-powered vehicle. We can electrify some vehicles and look at providing that infrastructure. We can, one of the things I'm a little interested in that we haven't talked about, I mean, the industrial sector is very big. And so I would imagine that the demand for power might look different in Louisiana than it looks in other places. Maybe it looks even more the same, that the peak is, is really high in the middle of the day. But because Louisiana is subject to so much extreme weather, there's a lot of power outages. There's a lot of disruptions in power. And that's where fleets of batteries, of electric vehicles that have batteries that can either be used to manage peak demand or can be used to provide emergency power. Imagine if every school district had electric buses, and those buses could be used to power emergency shelters or hospitals. That's an example of where you could build the resilience of Louisiana and the communities here, while at the same time reduce emissions from those vehicles. So I think another maybe objective might be to try to find solutions with multiple benefits and try to engage, to the points that were made early on about growing a constituency for this. So the constituency to not drive your car isn't a big constituency, but the constituency to be more resilient, to have more affordable transportation, to have less traffic on the roads. There are constituencies for those solutions. So when we come to objectives, I would say that, but I think there are some interesting intersections with growing the resilience of the state in this conversation.
Bidirectional charging is something that is already available in some vehicles. We don't have a lot of stations right now that, like the fueling stations, that are able to take the charge in, not just give the charge out. So, and I know there's a lot of universities and research that has been going out and pilot projects across the country with bidirectional charging. Then that's one of the kinds of resilience projects that we've been looking for grant opportunities for as well. So that's definitely on the minds of Clean Cities coalitions and fleets around the country. It's definitely for resilience purposes. So I want to echo that point.
This is Vivian Johnson. I have a question. We've touched on getting people from place to place, but we haven't really touched on other modes of transportation. And I'm not sure that this is in our bailiwick or in our charge, but you're going to also have to look at rail. You're going to have to look at shipping. You're going to have to look at the barge traffic that are on our smaller rivers. The ports of Baton Rouge, New Orleans, Spouchon all handle larger vessels. So is that included in our charge also, Lindsay?
Yes, and if I'll bring us back to that slide. We look back at our transportation sector. These are all of the different emission sources we'll want to address. So I wanted to ask, even thinking of aircraft and airports and boats as
Hey,
well.
Lindsay, this is Scott Gamble with Alexandria. Aviation may be a little more intricate as far as, as aircraft and alternative fuels go. But to kind of go off what Ms. Vale said a few minutes ago about the low-hanging fruit, I think that would be the airports and the support equipment, all the support that goes into supporting the aircraft. I believe that's something that can be done, I hate to use this word lightly, relatively easily with alternative fuels as far as using with all the support equipment. But right now, I know they're always looking at it, but I don't know of any alternative fuels for aircraft right now. But I do think that's something that we can really look at and assist in the support equipment at all the airports, especially all the commercial airports that goes into it. There's a tremendous amount that goes to supporting just one aircraft that comes in. And I think that's something that we could really look at and can do some good in that area.
There are a lot of terminal trucks that are using electric, the electric terminal trucks out there that are being used all over the country and have been used for years. So it's a proven technology right now. So we're not even getting experimental with what he's talking about. There's stuff out there.
That's right. But I do know as a fact that most of the airports in Louisiana, some may be using a small portion, but most of the commercial airports are not utilizing, that equipment that's already out there. So that's something that we do need to look at to see if we can start encouraging more airports to do that.
Right. And that last chart with the heavy duty vehicles showing such a small part of the pie, I kind of have a hard time believing that heavy duty vehicles are such a small part of our emissions for transportation, being that many of them get 3 to 5 miles per gallon and are utilizing diesel, and many of them are very old, so their emissions are quite bad. So I think that is something we definitely need to take another look at and talk about low-hanging fruit. If you reduce the emissions on those vehicles that get such poor gas mileage, that's your biggest bang for your buck right there.
And from a shipping standpoint, at least from Port Fourchon, its users, the vessel operators here, shore power is becoming much larger and more widely used. It takes an investment to do that. However, you receive your return on investment without utilizing that diesel fuel because it's cheaper to use the electricity than diesel fuel. So out of a cost savings for the long term, they're using it, but it's actually obviously assisting in emissions. So expanding on that idea is probably something that we need to look at, as well as just from an operator standpoint. We have one vessel operator in Harvey Gulf International that is really the leader in an LNG fueled offshore supply vessels, as well as now they've outfitted one of those LNG fueled vessels with battery power as well. So that's kind of like a new frontier on the vessel operation standpoint that I think is going to continue to expand as we move forward into the future.
Yeah, we've seen the effect on our annual report with shore power. We just have one company reporting to us with their emissions reductions due to shore power, and it made a huge difference in the greenhouse gas reductions on our annual report. So we've seen the proof in the numbers for that.
Well, this is a wonderful list of objectives, a list of starting points for objectives. And as I mentioned, we're also recording this, and we'll be taking notes and diving into the objectives further from everything that wasn't written on this one slide. Are there any other areas, any last areas you guys see the weakness before we move on? Well, wonderful. With that, let's jump back in just a little bit left that I want for us to cover today. So with that, I'll move that we go to agenda item 9. And just to bring us back to this structured decision-making process before we move on to next steps, we today have really spent time defining that second step, but also touched on the first step as well. And again, this is a very important part of the process to frame what we'll be looking for as we move into these emission reduction solutions. And so again, this isn't just process for process sake. It's not just talking about these things for the sake of having them out in the public on YouTube, but really to begin to drive us on the right process for this effort. And so let's move briefly into talking about our next steps from today. We've covered a lot today, but I wanted to show you guys our timeline to the interim report. As I mentioned, we have 2 months to reach our interim report, and I've highlighted in red the role of this committee in that process. And as it notes, we'll have 2 meetings before that interim report is published. So this first meeting, we have met to establish our fundamental objectives. And these objectives, which are being developed across all of our groups, even the climate task force as a whole has developed draft objectives. This will be the basis for developing our strategy. And so our co-chairs will present a draft of these objectives at the next task force meeting, which will likely be closer to the end of December. And so all of the co-chairs from the different sector committees and advisory groups will present those to the task force just in draft form, and the final objectives will be published in the interim report. So we still have a little bit more time to refine these objectives as we move forward. And the second thing to note on this is that in that second meeting, we'll have a discussion on opportunities and challenges and process for a solution, which takes us into these next steps between now and the next meeting. In case there was anything that you guys think of after this meeting or didn't have the chance to mention in fundamental objectives, you can send it either to my email or to the climate@la.gov by this Thursday. So it gives you about 2 full days to submit any additional objectives. And also for any members that weren't able to be present today, it gives them the opportunity to share the objectives as well. And as we work towards this second meeting, which will be held in January, I'm going to share with you guys a little bit later a Google Drive, and that will serve as kind of a resource dump. A lot of you are very experienced in transportation and have wonderful efforts that you've led or that you've been a part of or that you know of in different states and even within Louisiana. And so this will be a place where we can compile those shared resources that we have. And the goal is that then we'll be able to identify the gaps in knowledge that exist. So what do we need to know in order to make informed decisions? We don't want to make decisions without knowing the whole picture of what might be helpful for that. So that's kind of the next step. And so I'd ask you guys to send me those draft objectives and to start identifying those resources and uploading them to a Google Drive in the meantime. And we'll come back together in January, as I mentioned on the last slide. For this next meeting, I'll send out a doodle poll again, just because of the holidays. And then once we get into the new year, we'll just pick a day of the month that will make it very consistent and easy for everyone. So with that, I'd like to ask if our co-chairs have any additional next steps that they would like to do.
One thing I wanted to point out, particularly to Anne, is the percentages, and we actually do have tonnages for those different transportation sectors in millions of metric tons. But that all came from 2005, but that was done using the EPA's state inventory tool. So there's a lot of assumptions, I'm sure, and default values in there that were used, because you question the accuracy of only 3% coming from heavy diesel vehicles. So I don't know if you caught it in the presentation, but there is going to be an update to that inventory that's going to be done this summer. So when we're looking at the first target of reducing by 24 to 26% by 2025, we're almost in 2021. Unless we're going to do something real quick, it's basically whatever the inventory tool produces in the summer will tell us where we are, how close we are to that reduction target that we have. So I did want to point that out so you don't spend a lot of time searching for alternatives. I don't know what the latest data that report will be based on. I'm sure it'll be whatever, is readily available for the update, but I just wanted to point that out that that's coming up this summer. So.
Thanks, Eric. And no, Lindsay, I don't have any further next steps beyond what you pointed out. And I think we're going to move into public comments for now. We're going to move into agenda item 10, public comment. As we discussed at the top of the meeting, the importance of the public participating is really critical for us. And we're trying to find creative ways of doing this by way of our virtual realities. I think what we're set up to do here is take a 3-minute break. And considering how late we are in the hour, I want to make sure that we stick to that 3 minutes. And so it's 2:45. If we can come back at 2:48. I want to remind folks, as Eric instructed us at the top of the meeting, that if you have questions or critical feedback that you want to provide, the email is climate@la.gov, and we'll be accepting public comments and questions there. We want to make sure as much as possible that the public's input is documented in writing as well. So it's a great way for us to do that. Again, that's climate@la.gov, and we'll come back at about 2:48 or 2:49. Thank you, guys. We'll be right back. Right. Why don't we get started here? It looks like, I think, Lindsay, are you guys gonna, if we have any questions or comments, you're gonna read that into the record?
Yes, was. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Charles Suckler.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm just watching the email, so Lindsay doesn't have to do another thing. So we do have one public comment today. It's submitted by Jessica Hendricks, the State Policy Director of the Alliance for Affordable Energy. And her comment reads, while the aim of the Climate Task Force is to reduce carbon emissions, we must not miss the opportunity to right past wrongs, including creating more equitable structures to benefit all Louisianians. The Transportation Committee is in a unique position to do so and has a responsibility to consider more equitable solutions. These considerations should include better access to public transportation, as well as equitable electrification policies that allow all residents to access EV charging stations. We look forward to a robust and inclusive dialogue to promote more equitable, accessible, and carbon-free transportation policies for all Louisianians. That's
fantastic. Great. Thanks, Charles, for letting us know about that comment. I think it's a really important one, and it seems to jive really well with the conversation that was had among the committee members with regard to some of those opportunities. I think there's been a pretty robust suggestion that the more we can make these recommendations and the work that we do actually work for people and industry and our communities, the much more likely it is that we'll be successful, not only from an implementation perspective, but the really difficult work of getting any set of recommendations acted upon is going to really depend on us having all Louisianans, or as many as possible, behind those recommendations and really be able to see themselves by way of experience inside of those recommendations. All right, I think, Eric, I'm turning it over to you. It looks like we are coming to a close. I'm not sure if any, before we move to adjourn, if any other committee members have any last comments or points of check-in that you want to make that we can document, anything that we can do to improve on our process here. We are welcoming any constructive criticism or any other points that you want to make in general that you didn't get a chance to make before we leave each other today. All right, I know this is not a shrinking crowd, so that must mean we did a pretty decent job today. All right, good deal. Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, good. Thank you, everyone. And I very much enjoyed listening to everyone speak. And I thought it was very interesting. And I'm glad that you all spoke up. And I thought it was really good and appreciate that. And so with that, I think we've been at this for almost 2 hours now, an hour and 50 minutes. So that's a long time to sit in a Zoom call. But we do appreciate your patience and your attendance. And so with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Nobody wants to adjourn? So we'll stay here. Okay, we'll stay here. All right. Is there a second to that?
A second.
Second.
And I guess there's a unanimous yes, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anybody opposed to adjourning? Hearing none, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, everybody. You all take
Thanks,
care.
everyone.
Until next time.
Bye. Thank you.